In this video, we're going to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, often called IPBES or IPBES. The IPBES is organized under the auspices of the United Nations and brings together a large group of international scientists who worked to develop a report for the international policymaking community within the United Nations. The focus of the IPBES is to evaluate and synthesize our understanding of the causes for declines in biodiversity and what those losses mean for ecosystem services. One key take-home message from this video is that the loss of biodiversity is one of those environmental issues that is influenced by practically everything we do as humans. We lose genes, species, and ecosystems because of land use decisions like cutting forests, but also because of pollution, the use of pesticides, and because of other environmental issues like climate change. That means that the solutions to the problem have to be equally complex and need to engage countries around the world in a combined effort to slow the loss of species through new policies at the national or international level. With that in mind, let's go through the IPBES report from 2019 to learn more about the international perspective on the loss of biodiversity. After you watch this video, you should be able to explain the general patterns in biodiversity over the last few decades and how these have changed in relation to key global drivers of change. You should be able to differentiate between direct and indirect drivers of change, and you should be able to describe progress toward reductions toward biodiversity loss. Lastly, you should be able to provide some suggestions of approaches which may be used to reduce the loss of biodiversity in the future. To start with, I want to say a little bit more about international assessments because these types of approaches are becoming increasingly important in environmental science. The IPBES assessment is similar to the process that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, commonly called the IPCC. And the basic idea with these assessments is to create an intergovernmental body that can assess the state of the science, in this case around biodiversity and ecosystem services, and organize that information in a way that can support decision makers at the national and international scale. The way that happens is that the UN requests that an assessment be done. It then also designates an organization to run the assessment. And that organization for the IPBES assessment is the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP. Typically, an assessment will have a secretariat, which is an organization that manages the process, and the process will include the selection of a large number of international scientists who will then lead and participate in the assessment. Let's start with the bad news first, and that's that biodiversity is declining across the globe. The yellow and orange and red colors on the top graph show the percentage of each group of organisms that is vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And for some of these groups of species, these numbers are very large. In graph B down below, you see extinctions since 1500, and you should immediately notice how much extinctions have increased during the 20th century, and how much they've increased across a range of different types of animal species. Graph C shows a summary of data from the IUCN Red List, which is a collection of species that are endangered or threatened. And unfortunately, since 1985 to the present, there have been declines in species survival across a range of groups, and particularly in corals, which are threatened by ocean acidification, warming ocean temperatures, and increased coastal pollution. In the IPBES report, there are 18 major categories that describe nature's contribution to people. Reading from the top of this list, this includes things like habitat creation and maintenance, pollination and dispersal of seeds, regulation of air quality, regulation of climate, and many others. The key point here is shown by the arrows, most of which are declining, which indicates that for each of these broad categories, there has been a decline in the ability of nature to provide key services to humanity in 14 of these 18 categories. This type of decline has a potential to impact human livelihoods across the world. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the causes of diversity decline are complex. And in the IPBES report, these causes are split into two different big functional groups called indirect and direct drivers. The indirect drivers include a broad array of underlying social factors and societal factors. This includes population growth in the demographic and social cultural bucket, economic growth, institutional dynamics, and governance at the national and international level, as well as conflicts and epidemics, which we all know have the potential to create massive disruption in global systems. These indirect drivers feed a series of direct drivers, which are the actual day-to-day causes of biodiversity decline. These are important to know and include land and sea use change, direct exploitation, which means the use of species for human purposes, climate change, which is impacting ecosystems around the world, pollution of air and water, and invasive alien species, which are organisms that are not native to a particular location, but when introduced, they take off and displace native species. Collectively, these direct drivers have led to the dire statistics that are shown on the right side of this slide. Why is the world changing so quickly? Well, you probably know the answer to this question, but it's interesting to see how many of the key underlying factors have shifted in the past 40 years. In this graph, you see data on a key set of factors that impact biodiversity. The graphs are separated into the developed countries like the United States or Europe, developing economies like China, and the least economically developed parts of the world, which include places like Kenya and many of the other sub-Saharan African nations. As you can see across these graphs, economic growth has increased consistently for most of these categories of countries. Domestic material consumption has been flat or increasing. Extraction of living biomass has increased dramatically, especially in the developing economies. And fertilizer use has tended to go up across the board. Of these trends, there are two that are actually positive. The first is that air pollution has tended to decline. And second, there's been an increase in protected biodiversity areas across all of these different national economic categories. This all brings us back to the question of how do we reduce our impacts on global biodiversity? And not surprisingly, there isn't a simple single answer. When a problem spans so many parts of the economy and impacts so many countries around the world, the solutions are going to be complex. But let's look at a few of these. On the left side of the figure from the IPBES report, we see a number of different policy mechanisms that can be deployed to help reduce diversity loss. Some of these are quite obvious, like environmental law at the national or international level. And some are probably less obvious, including things like capacity building, which means creating the human capacity to support biodiversity conservation and protection. There is now a big international focus on supporting improved decision-making that can make both economies and natural systems more resilient in the face of political, social, environmental uncertainty. The leverage points at the bottom of the figure highlight a number of things that can be done even at the individual level. A couple of straightforward ones are reducing total consumption and waste, so there is less pressure on the Earth's ecosystems, and things like promoting education and knowledge generation so that the broader population is made more aware of these issues. There are a number of technical and economic areas here, which include focusing on technology innovation or looking at how to better value the services that nature provides to humanities in an economic sense. There are also a set of examples that focus on the reduction of inequality, broadening our vision of what makes a good life, and shifting our priorities and values to focus on actions that will help preserve global biodiversity. To summarize, it's probably not a surprise to most of you that biodiversity trends are not good, nor is it likely surprising that biodiversity loss results in large part from rising consumption and resource use. The key causes of biodiversity loss include land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species expansion. There is good news here, though. There has been an increase in the number of protected areas, and there's a rising international attention on biodiversity that's leading to a new and more vibrant global conversation about how to address this issue. Lastly, the causes of diversity decline are complex, and that means that there are a whole wide range of solutions that range from what individuals can do up to what nations and international bodies can do to address this issue. That may be a little overwhelming, but it also should make you feel good because there are things that you can actually do as an individual to start addressing these issues.